Hey everyone, welcome back to Perfect Prey. Thank you so much for being here. Please remember to subscribe and share. I hear from so many of you that, you understand why I call this a podcast Perfect Prey. There's certain traits that we have that abusers just oftentimes sadly can be drawn towards. And I'm so grateful to have Dr. Peter Salerno here again. He's been on the podcast before. You probably remember. He's the author of Traumatic Cognitive Dissonance and the Nature and Nurture of Narcissism. And he has helped bring so much clarity to this conversation. And Peter, thank you so much for being here. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me again. We had a great conversation last time, so I'm looking forward to this. So I'm Peter Salerno, and I'm the author of those two books Dr. C just mentioned. Predominantly now what I'm doing is educating and training on pathological relationship abuse, the type of abuse that results from being in relationships with pathological personalities, and just trying to consult and assist people in helping identify what they're dealing with and what their options are is like the bulk of my work as of late.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing. I know we were talking before the call about just having people reach out and say, hey, is this what's going on with me? Or can you describe, or can you help bring clarity for me? And sometimes, as we've talked about, people just need validation that they're not crazy, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, because the dissonance that's created within the context of these relationships is what prevents them from really knowing whether or not they're crazy. And so it's this vicious cycle. And so I think traditional therapy can be very helpful, but at the same time, sometimes, like you said, people just need to be believed, validated, and then they need some education on some decision making and things like that. And so it's
Yeah, navigating the narcissism or the pathology. It might be a good time, actually. Can you please explain cognitive dissonance? How would you describe that?
Cognitive dissonance is actually a term that comes from like social learning theory a while ago when basically two opposing thoughts or beliefs are occurring simultaneously. It's making it difficult for somebody to land on one or the other. And so it creates a lot of internal discomfort, like an internal clash. One good example of this, let's say a soldier who's a really good person and they go on a tour and they end up having to shoot people. They come home and they have this idea of themselves of being like a decent person who served their country, but then at the same time they have shot people and they feel like that they're a killer. And so in their mind, they're bouncing back and forth between like, well, am I a good human being or am I a killer? And obviously, that's not something people on the outside could say, well, obviously, you're not a killer. You were just serving and doing your duty. And this isn't something you do in your personal civilian life. So what's the trouble? Well, the trouble is the brain doesn't necessarily latch on to that and make that distinction. And so they're caught between the dissonance of, am I a good person or am I somebody who's capable of committing murder? That's something that could create cognitive dissonance. Now, that's not what I would call traumatic cognitive dissonance, even though that could be very traumatic. Traumatic cognitive dissonance to me is when that opposing, conflicting thought or clash in your mind of these two elements that aren't in alignment is coerced and manipulated by somebody.
Mm.
So the difference to me between cognitive dissonance and traumatic cognitive dissonance is when we're dealing with traumatic cognitive dissonance, somebody is intentionally trying to confuse you so that they can control you or manipulate you even further. So it's an overt or covert, intentional mixing up of your thought process rather than it just happening to be an experience that took place.
What's interesting is you're using traumatic, and I use the word malicious when
Mm,
instead of calling it parental alienation or child and mother sabotage, which focuses primarily on mothers, had that relationship being broken, I call it a malicious fracturing of attachment. But to your point, it's a traumatic fracturing of attachment, right? Yeah, I like that a lot too. So there's intent is the
yes.
point. There's
Yeah, that's the
intent.
point.
And I think it's a good segue because isn't it true that the greater the pain of acknowledging what you're disassociating from, the more that you're going to disassociate, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it makes me think of children. And that's kind of part of our call today is like how children can know clearly they've seen abuse. We know that children aren't witnesses or witnesses are exposed to. We know they've actually experienced it in their bodies, but that may have happened. they've heard yelling and screaming. They've learned to regulate their behaviors. They're walking on eggshells all the time, just like the safe, protective parent. Yet they can very quickly disassociate from that person, that caretaker being an abuser. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that happens?
Yeah, you're describing essentially these survival mechanisms that are necessary. We have defense mechanisms and survival mechanisms for very good reason. They're not actually, I think sometimes people hear those terms and think that they're immature or they're weak ways of coping, but they're essential, especially for children who are in a situation that they have no control of, even physical control. They can't just excuse themselves and walk away from it. Oftentimes adults can't either. But there's this additional helplessness when there's an abusive parent and you are trying to make sense of that as a child. And things like dissociation or fracturing oneself or trying to accommodate or creating alternative realities in a way. All, by the way, are part of the cognitive dissonance process too. So we could even look at that as a defense mechanism in a way. But yeah, there's this necessity of altering things in order to survive for children who are being abused by someone that is supposed to be taking care of them and keeping them safe.
Yeah, yeah. I have moms and dads. I have male clients too who are often, how could they forget like what happened or why don't they understand? And I always reflect back to you forgot. You became trauma bonded to that abuser. You disassociated from those experiences. That's why it took you 5 times to leave or
Yeah.
escape. Yeah.
And the dissonance happens in kids, it happens in adults, and it's interesting how if the dissonance is created in the context of the relationship, I think a lot of people are expecting that there's going to be clarity in the relationship, but it's not going to happen because the relationship and the abuse is what caused the disorientation in the first place. And I think also trying to hold these opposing perspectives of maybe sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, sometimes they're charming, sometimes they're maddening, sometimes they're loving, sometimes they're hurtful. And your brain obviously is a kind of a prediction machine that wants to land on something so it knows the next step. And so it's really bouncing back and forth between these two things. I think ultimately what ends up having to happen for people who are stuck is they lean more towards the, well, there's enough good that I'm gonna find a way to make sense of this and rationalize it and justify it. And then sadly that opens you more to exploitation and abuse, but it makes sense that the brain and the nervous system are trying to reconcile and come to terms with it.
Sometimes it's safest to
Yes.
align. That's what I tell my protective parents all the time. And then I'm thinking about my own children. Their dad was not aggressive. We
Mhm.
did not come off, it was more fun and permissive. And so there was this, here's me trying to be a helpful parent who's creating structure and boundaries. And yes, you need a part-time job. You're 16. No, it's
Yeah.
time to go to bed. All of those parts of a child's life that are really important. And I was being undermined. And so some parents, I want moms and dads out there to hear that the abuser doesn't have to be overtly aggressive for this to occur. The abuser can be insidiously like trying to counterparent in some way or to diminish you in some way. And then in that, they diminish the child. The
Yes.
child doesn't feel valuable, right?
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting you brought that up. I was listening to an interview the other day from a forensic psychologist who deals with specifically sexual serial murder and murderers, and how when he interviewed the spouses of the serial killers and the children, they said that their father, because it was predominantly male offenders, they go, in fact, we experienced him as very passive and benign in a way that was not helpful because when the mother would try to enforce boundaries, the serial killing sadistic father would disrupt that by being overly passive, almost like Disneyland dad.
You don't have to do that. Don't worry
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. And then at the same time had this completely separate life where they were going around and deriving sexual gratification from killing multiple people. It's not always this overt aggression, coercion. It's like you said, subtle, insidious. Sometimes they can play the role of the rescuer, the feigned
Mhm,
rescuer, right?
mhm.
And then become the favorite. And then that's very confusing for kids when they finally realize what's going on, or when there's a separation and they don't understand why the family has to split up. We could go down the rabbit hole here, but
There's so many things. I'm thinking about the victim, like the victim mentality.
Mhm.
And then in some cases, these abusers become very enmeshed with the
Mhm.
children, which it's really like a really uncomfortable, like really gross way for a parent to have a relationship with a child, right? But the child is so vulnerable
Yeah.
to receiving love and acceptance from this parent that they know at their core. I always say at their core, they know that person's not safe.
Yeah.
But what do? When you're in the den with a wolf, you try to play nice. And even if
That's
the
right.
wolf isn't like showing their teeth, you've seen how this wolf is with maybe the safe protective parent. You've seen that, or with a sibling, because so much triangulation is
Yeah.
often going on too. Yeah, I mean, it brings me to this. I think what I know a lot of people ask me, and I'm sure you have such great insight on this, is so we're born a certain way, but I also try always to give protective parents hope, because sometimes children will align with the aggressor, right?
Yeah.
Simply because that feels safest. And they seem to take on some of the character traits of the abuser. And I
Sure.
think, according to your research and the research that's out there, they may have a predisposition.
Mhm.
But I also have found with many of my clients that if they insert some certain strategies, and I think the primary one is to really create a space where children don't feel shamed for their behavior. Even if
Mhm.
they're behaving badly, they don't feel shamed. And it doesn't mean we accept it, that we can create a space of connection, and
Mhm.
that in that connection, we can return them or reignite their attachment with us. And if we can, in some children, it may be like they may be older, it may be more, it's more challenging. My experiences is more challenging as they age. But if we can insert at a very young age a really clear, how shall I say, difference, I guess, between who we are, who the abuser describes us as, and
Mhm.
who the abuser is. And that even if they're aligning because it feels safe, they know that we're going to be fully accepting of them.
Mhm.
And no matter how they behave, as raw as they are, that doesn't ignite the shame in them. And for me, the more we ignite the shame, the more that we're fortifying exactly what the abuser wants. The abuser wants them to feel unvaluable or invaluable, wants them to feel that they're not worthy of love, wants them to feel they can't authentically be themselves, wants them to think that protective, safe parent actually doesn't like them. It's like, how dare you treat me this way? You're an awful child.
Yeah.
And I work with my protective parents on how to not do that, because I think that if there's hope to create a healthier attachment and personality,
Mhm.
that's how we do it. So that was a lot, but I'm wondering your
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah. So what I'll say is, I never want to be misunderstood as someone who's claiming to be a biological determinist, because that's just not a real thing. Okay. And I've never intended to throw the environmental baby out with the bathwater with this new research. What I'm trying to do is incorporate this missing link that has been ignored and dismissed for so long, and that explains a lot of the confusion related to what can really cause personality pathology to develop, right? And there's never just one cause. But to your point, predisposition doesn't mean prediction, it doesn't imply prediction. What we have seen is that I think one of the reasons I get some controversy is because I do believe that pathological traits are present in children, and most people say no, that's not something that happens until like adolescence or adulthood. But there's research to show that even callous unemotional traits, which are the traits that we typically associate with psychopathy, are present in children like as early as 2, right? That's not intended to scare people. It's intended to inform people that if you're seeing these indicators early on, whether there's abuse in the environment or not, if you're seeing these indicators that are going to make that kid's life hard, because to be callous and unemotional in a emotional world, it's going to be hard for them. We need to intervene as soon as possible. And there have been interventions with children where post therapy with the right effective interventions, the brain structure and functioning has changed to where they no longer meet the criteria for whatever was pathological. So
Mhm.
I encourage people rather to dismiss the idea that children could misbehave or could have a predisposition to misbehave. I encourage people to look for it, acknowledge it, and then get them help as soon as possible, because that's the best defense against something escalating, right? I will say there are cases that, and they're rare, but there are cases where people are just going to be the way they're going to be. And
Mhm.
when I'm talking about the extreme, more rare cases of individuals where they have such a deficiency that they're not even interested in trying to collaborate or cooperate with people in life, and they're going to end up doing what they do. But that's very rare. But when
Right.
we're talking about this continuum or this dimension of like narcissism and other personality disorders that could potentially have a vulnerability to developing that, and then they have abuse in their environment as well, which could exacerbate that, get them help as soon as possible, because the less time they have to practice expressing those traits, the better chance they might have of modifying and having a better quality life.
No, that makes perfect sense. I think we align directly on that. I guess I'm thinking about all the children who are growing up in these family systems, and they're sharing time between the home of this protective parent and the abuser. And the abuser is actually trying really hard to exert coercion and control on
Yeah.
the child, right? They're telling the child, your mother doesn't really love you, or too bad your mom works all the time, or her new boyfriend's more important, or she took all the family money. So the narrative becomes, that person isn't safe. I
Yeah,
can't be myself. And I feel like that can lead us towards more harm for that child's developing personality. Right.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to be influenced by that, especially if the person is really, really skilled at being manipulative and believable. Obviously, the child's going to be impacted by that. And I've heard of a number of different ways to handle that. One is to not get too preoccupied with undoing that, like the parent who is being framed, let's say, or ambushed or whatever, sabotaged. I wouldn't try to focus on, too much on undoing that so much as just
Mhm.
showing who you truly are and letting that contradict itself in the mind of the child, because children do have minds of their own. They can
Yeah.
understand authenticity, and they may not be as sophisticated in being able to rely on their gut instinct. If someone's telling them something about you that's not true, yes, can you be conditioned to believe it? 100%. I don't think the response to that, though, is to panic and then try to undo it in a way where it's causing more stress and needless drama, chaos. But at the same time, it needs to be dealt with, and maybe you're the one to speak to about that. How do we deal with when somebody has successfully conditioned or brainwashed or coerced a child into thinking that the safe parent is the one who you need to be suspicious of them?
Absolutely. It's so true, right? They become conditioned. It's like a cult, I say, right? It's literally a programming. And then they're coming home programmed after a weekend or a day or 2 hours with the abuser. And I always say the abuser has intention. So you need to have intention. Like you can't just say, oh, my kid's coming home this weekend, or you need to actually be thinking about what are the things your kid has heard this weekend, either
Yeah.
covertly or overtly about you or your family or your home experiences. They play hockey and the abuser doesn't like hockey. What are the things your child's hearing? And then be ready. Like, so it's like I call it the three P's: predict what the abuser's doing, then prepare yourself, like literally fortify yourself. Because how do you take, as you know, a trauma victim, someone who suffered significant trauma, the child comes home and calls you a horrible name or accuses you of the same thing the abuser's accusing you of. It's
Right.
like, oh my gosh, here we go again. How much
Yeah.
more am I supposed to take? But if you can actually create in you a response that you've practiced, the whole empty chair, or with a
Yeah.
friend, your child's attacking you verbally with these words, they're going to do it. And if
Hmm.
you can practice a response, then you're going to better be able to protect yourself, but also them, because you're not going to be reactive. And,
100%.
but that's intentional work. It's like
Yes.
really hard, intentional work, which a lot of people, that's the switch. It's like, I used to say when my kids came home, I knew if they were coming for Sunday dinner, and I was lucky enough to get them for Sunday dinner because I lived in a tiny apartment and they lived in our big, beautiful home. And my daughter was alienated for sure, the word would be, right? But she'd come because she liked my cooking. So I had that going for me. And they'd come home and I would just be like, okay, what am I going to hear this week?
Yeah.
How much fun did they have with my ex and his girlfriend? What was going to trigger me and how was I going to be able to handle that? Almost like, and I'm sure you would agree, if we don't trick our brain into having a different response, our brain's going to go right back to the
Yes.
old response,
Oh,
right?
100%. Yeah. Mental rehearsal is something that I think people need to do. You need to know what buttons are going to be pushed, anticipate them, and you need to rehearse and have available responses ready to de-escalate your own emotional reaction to what you're going to be hearing, that like the parroting or the mimicking of the abusive parent that now is you're seeing in the child who was coerced into bringing it home to you and giving it to you I think that you can practice mentally rehearsing what you're going to say in the event that you hear the name that you were called, the blame externalization, or whatever it is that's going to happen, that the kid is being used as a conduit to basically deliver to you, sadly, because they're using their own children and exploiting them to hurt you. The more you have, the more you know what buttons can be pushed in you, we all have them, and the more you know what response you're going to have to prepare for the assault, if you will, the verbal assault or whatever, the better you are at, you're going to be prepared to modify your response, and your behavior will be altered as a result of having rehearsed it and being prepared. So I agree with you. There needs to be an intentional, sadly, there needs to be an intentionality to what you're going to face when your child comes home.
Yeah. And I always try to frame it that there's no one better to heal your child than you.
That's
You have
right.
so much power, good power, personal power to actually shift or pivot the
Yeah.
direction your child's going in. And your response or reaction, right? I see reactions as being a little bit more biological, right? But your practice, your mental rehearsing, your response can really change things significantly for that child in that moment. And it creates space where, wait a minute, this place isn't dangerous. I've been told it's dangerous. I've been told she's crazy. I've been told all these things. This place is not what I've been told.
Right.
Now, I think the point is that then they go back and it happens again. It's not ending. It's a long, you have to, it's like, I call it a marathon. This is not a sprint. This is like, you are in this for the long term, but that I think is very hopeful when we talk about it this way, right?
And I think they're going to get whether they know it or not, at an implicit level, they're going to get a consistency where they're okay. So they're being told that this is the way it is, but then they go and experience it. That doesn't add up. And then they can settle into that eventually. And again, it's not about undoing or panicking. What exactly did they say? You don't want to go there. You just want to provide the evidence so they can fact check. You know what? This is the 10th time I've come home. I thought that this was supposed to happen. I said this to mom because dad said this about her, and it never happened. Where's the fire? Like eventually they're going to realize, I don't know if this is accurate. It doesn't feel accurate. I'm getting a completely different emotional experience when I'm
Mhm,
here. I'm expecting one thing and I'm getting another. And
mhm.
that is corrective. For a lot of kids, it's very corrective. They're eventually going to not be able to deny the reality of that.
That's right. It creates clarity,
Yeah.
right? About discerning which parent is the abuser, which one is not. And I often say we've all, as you know, trauma victims don't always behave. We're not always at our best game, are we? So sometimes we behave out of character, and we may do that with our kids. And we don't have to be perfect. How we handle our imperfections also says so much because
Absolutely.
abusers,
Yeah.
yeah.
And something that's kind of interesting about this is when I used to work with adolescents in my therapy practice, I would have some parents who did not have the best interest of their child in the therapy process. They found it threatening, or they saw it as something that they couldn't control, and so they didn't like the idea. And so I would experience this as a clinician where the child would come to see me and they would be suspicious of the therapy process because the parent was saying, if they say anything contrary to what I say to you, or if they say anything about me that is unfavorable, you can't trust them. They're trying to turn you against me. And this wasn't explicitly stated to me, but I could sense sometimes there was a the alliance was ruptured in some way. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to convince that young child client, hey, maybe your mother's trying to create division here because this is helping you. You don't have to do that. You don't have to undo it. You just need to show up and be present and confident that you know that you're doing the right thing. And it even works itself out in that dynamic, right? So my point is, you there's going to be times when people are going to try to coerce you, brainwash you, condition you to believe something, and I think people who are victims of that are quick to feel this urgency that it needs to be corrected or explained away or convinced. Don't believe that. I don't think that that's the best approach. I think that, like you said, they go home and there's this reality of this experience. Now, you can use your words with that, of course, but oftentimes when we talk about interpersonal neurobiology, like there's going to be a felt sense. That's not super consistent with what I'm actually experiencing. Like my dad's saying this about my mom, but it's just, it's not happening.
Yeah. No, totally. And you just gave me another idea for another podcast because with you, because we can talk about therapists,
Yeah.
right? Because unfortunately, I have clients who their children are going to therapy and they are being coerced in therapy. So we have therapists who are violating ethics very often. As you know, I post about it sometimes. We're forcing children into repair therapy. And then we're telling a child, why won't you talk to your dad? Well, I just saw him literally give my mother 9 stitches. What are you talking about? But also the idea that when I always say to protective parents, so like, I want my kid in therapy, I want my kid in therapy. If they went to therapy, they'd know that I'm safe. And I said, but who are they getting the ride to therapy with? Who's driving them to therapy and in the car is
Yeah.
ensuring that when they go into therapy, I'll tell you a little story, Peter. I used to pay my daughter to go to therapy, right? I paid her to go to therapy and she went to therapy and she talked badly about me.
Yeah.
Why? Right? Because she was aligned and she didn't really know, she wasn't allowed to say anything bad about the other person. And so we look back on that now and we can chuckle. So that's the good news. But the reality is that there's coercion going on with the abuser prior to therapy. Sadly, there's some therapists who are not recognizing that this isn't healthy for children. Like
Mhm.
whether like it's an interesting thing because a protective parent will say to me, but I'm the safe parent, so they should go to therapy with me. And I'm like, well, if they're willing to go, that's one thing. But if they're not willing to go, then it's actually coercion. And they're going to be forced to say things they don't want to say. And
Mhm.
then they're going to feel a lot of shame about that. And if
Right.
they feel shame, you're actually fortifying in them those traits that we don't want them to have. Does that sound like a little bit too much of a rabbit hole? Because that's the rabbit hole I go down.
No, not at all. Not at all. No.
It's pretty convoluted, the whole
Yeah.
thing.
It is. It
Mhm.
really is. A
And
lot of
imagine the brain of an abuser who's able to actually navigate all of that. I think it's quite remarkable.
I know. And there's so many things that, as we're talking about this, it's that require reform, that require revisiting and new understanding on how these methods and these things that are in place are really hurting kids.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I reflect upon Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's work where he came up with developmental trauma disorder, but it was denied through the American Psychological Association to be in the DSM-5. And he was trying really hard to show that ADHD and, of course, oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder could sometimes, not always for sure, but could sometimes be a trajectory, like it could all a spectrum and it happens in a row. And then if we could just look at what's going on in the family system,
Hmm.
we could actually peg the problem, right? And he was looking through a violent incident model, so it's a little archaic, but still, he was saying children growing up in domestic violence were actually oftentimes they may have ADHD, but actually, let's look at what else could be going on that's creating a dysregulated state. And
Certainly.
yeah,
Yeah. Wow.
there's lots to
Lots to talk about.
discuss. I guess maybe if you could tell people where to find you and how to connect, that'd be awesome.
Sure. So I'm on Instagram and YouTube at Dr. Peter Salerno. I have some books on Amazon that you mentioned, Traumatic Cognitive Dissonance and the Nature and Nurture of Narcissism, and have some other interviews floating around
Oh,
on
yeah.
on multiple platforms. And then I have a website, drpetersalerno.com, where you can find information about specifically what I do and what my approach is and things like that.
Well, thank you so much for being here again. I think we should probably convene maybe you and maybe Dr. Macaluso. That'd be kind of cool to talk about therapists and how sometimes therapy can be, how we
Yeah,
have to educate therapists. I'm trying very hard to get the word out, but we need to educate therapists on understanding what this really looks like and
yeah, that would
identifying.
be, yeah, the three of us together with having a conversation about that, given that we've experienced so much of that would be a very powerful conversation for the general public. I think
Yeah, I think so. I
very
think we should
useful.
do that. All
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right.